What is your personal experience with facial recognition and how it has affected your life?
I usually use facial recognition to, for example, unlock my cell phone, to tag friends on Facebook, accessing apps, and make payments. Facial recognition offers a quick and automatic and seamless experience. Additionally, confirming the identity using this technology could be more secure because there is nothing such as ID or key that can be stolen or lost.
So one of the experience I wanted to share, which happened to me last week, is I actually forgot the password of one of the banking application. So rather than calling the bank to reset my password, luckily I set up the facial recognition before then. So I was able to log on the app using my face. And the customer service was, they did not need to contact me to validate it was me logging on the app because apparently the accuracy using the facial recognition will be a lot higher compared to using the traditional authentication way.
We witness or hear about how it can affect people's lives. For example, people can get arrested by facial recognition matches. They are used in interviews or they can be used for monitoring employees in workplaces and monitoring students, especially now that classes are remote and they are being used for watching a student taking exams.
I think you've got some very well-informed participants who gave a really good overview of some of the different ways that facial recognition is cropping up in our society for authentication or identification purposes, particularly with sensitive applications like banking, for employee and student monitoring, and for policing contexts. And of course, there's sort of, from a civil liberties perspective, there's a sliding range of concerns as you go down that spectrum from one-on-one authentication with consent down to potentially, using it for arrests and during investigations in policing contexts.
Let's take a scenario here where a store has cameras inside of it, is constantly recording video, and then one day they decide to do facial recognition on all their past video.
I think it would be okay as long as my identity is not revealed. Because I guess the use of this technology for customer tracking would, in the long term, will improve the shopping experience and the customer service.
Even before facial recognition was around, the security cameras were used to identify the suspects if something wrong happens.
I don't see it necessary to share my facial information with the store. I could still log on to my account using the traditional username, password authentication, and enter my credit card information to complete my transaction. There were also multi-layers authentication or validation procedures happening to make sure I'm actually the one authorizing the transaction. And in case there was a fraudulent transaction happened, I could always dispute it with the vendor or bank afterward to resolve it.
The fact that for the last 20 or 30 years, we've become very accustomed to seeing cameras up in the corners of places like shopping malls. We've become used to seeing those little signs on the door that says, "Smile, you're on camera," or "We're recording for your security and safety." That people are conflating facial recognition and security in a really interesting way here. Your first participant said, well, I think it's okay if they keep the video, use it later for facial recognition as long as they don't identify me. But there'd really be no purpose for running facial recognition specifically unless they are trying to identify patrons. Now, there is a category of face surveillance called facial analytics. And in that category, they could possibly be doing things like trying to collect demographic data. So if you're old or young, if you're white or black, if you're male or female. And that's a slightly less intrusive use of the technology, but it still involves capturing your personal information, the image of your face. It still involves a use of that information for data processing. And there was a recent investigation in Canada into the Cadillac Fairview Mall's use of facial analytics. where they hid little cameras inside their information kiosks and were collecting that kind of demographic data about their customers with the argument that it would improve somehow the shopping experience if they could know who their customers are. And the privacy commissioners of Canada, along with other commissioners who have responsibility for private sector legislation, which is Quebec, BC, and Alberta, jointly ruled that regardless of whether or not it was recognition or whether it was analytics, because it was a use of personal information, there should have been meaningful consent given. So a scenario like this, where the store recorded the video and told people on little stickers at the door that it was for security purposes and later wanted to run analytics, would be non-consensual and would not be appropriate under Canadian law.
Would you shop at a store that stated or claimed that they use facial recognition for customer tracking?
I think it's like a trade-off. One side is definitely the benefit and also convenience using the technology, but the other side is definitely the potential risk. I will probably go through the statement or maybe do some research before then to make sure I'm comfortable of their protection or controls in place before I choose to use their services.
Yes, I would shop at a store that use the facial recognition, but only if my identities remain anonymous.
I would also shop from those type of stores because I think it makes the shopping experience very convenient. And from the privacy aspect, I would say I think this transition to using facial recognition instead of credit cards is similar to transition from cash to credit card. For sure, it first caused privacy concerns as credit card payments can be tracked, and this type of payment is no different than that, I think.
So the person who identified it as a trade-off is exactly right. Unfortunately, there aren't that many people who would be so diligent as to go through the policies and figure out whether or not the ways in which the facial recognition technology was being used were acceptable or not. And what we know from the ways that it's currently being used in Canada is, in fact, often we don't know, we're not properly told, consent isn't given. And so if you don't know that it's being used, you never have the opportunity to go and look at those policies and practices in the first place. So first of all, we need some policy action and some business person corporate social responsibility around making sure if they're going to use these technologies that people are appropriately informed and that those policies that your participant said she would want to go through are actually accessible to people. I mean, the other thing that pops up is the equating of facial recognition with convenience. So right now in Canada, we don't actually have places that allow you to pay with your face in physical spaces, although there is one grocery store chain that has said that they're looking into acquiring and using that technology. But it was an interesting comparison that your participant made between credit card technology, which allows increased tracking versus paying with cash, and facial recognition. Looking at it on that kind of spectrum, I think the critical difference is if you lose your credit card, if your credit card gets stolen, you contact the provider and they replace it with a new number so that no one could use that old number to steal from you. If you're using your face, it's not a simple matter to replace your face. So the security and the privacy considerations, when we're talking about a biometric identifier that is so intimately tied to your body, it is in fact your body, ups the ante in a way that makes it not just sort of qualitatively different on a spectrum, but also quantitatively different in terms of the risk and harm to individuals if it goes wrong.
Who here has a cell phone? We pretty much all do, right? So when you sign up for a cell phone, you do a credit check, and that credit check carries with you, and it sort of enforces what your plan is, for instance. Would it make more sense to have facial recognition make it more secure?
I think, in fact, it would be more secure to, for example, do identification with our face than having like a password. that can be lost or stolen. Using facial ID is better, but it comes down to how the companies are handling the data and what they are doing with that data as well.
By introducing this technology without the proper guidance or control, it would definitely introduce a lot of like potential risks or even like an ethical like perspective there.
Yeah, I think using facial recognition could be more secure, but still the facial recognition algorithms are not 100% accurate yet.
There is an argument that the kind of one-to-one identification that can come from an accurate facial biometric is a means of secure authentication if, as one of your participants very rightly pointed out, the policies and practices and procedures in place and the safeguards, including ideally legal statutory safeguards for the information, are all there to create a firm foundation for the technology and its use. Unfortunately, we don't have that firm foundation yet in Canada. The laws, we don't have specific laws that protect very sensitive biometric information, except in the province of Quebec. We do have a recognition legally that biometric information is particularly sensitive, and we have some rulings from the Privacy Commissioner of Canada in that regard. But from my perspective, we don't have the right legal framework in place to provide the kinds of protections we need when that kind of very sensitive data is being used for relatively trivial, frankly, purposes like unlocking a phone when there are other ways that it can be done, including with more secure biometrics that carry less risk of facilitating mass surveillance, such as a fingerprint.
Do we have any privacy concerns for applications using facial recognition from the government or private business? And if so, why?
In an ideal society where democracy or relative freedom exists, actually facial recognition can be beneficial. It can prevent crimes and bring safety and convenience. But unfortunately, it's not the case in many countries. So for government of those countries, facial recognition is just another tool to further control citizens. However, there are already other tools to constantly monitor citizens by governments, and it's not limited to facial recognitions. They already have huge databases they can use to punish people not only for crime or legitimate reasons, but for any deviation that they consider a threat for their power. For example, there's been a platform called WeChat in China, which was started as a chat platform, but now it can be used basically for their everyday tasks or actions, and state security is monitoring everything already. So the concern is not only related to facial recognition, but how citizens' data are being used.
It's not guaranteed that even the democratic government could potentially abuse the technology as well for some benefits. So, for example, the real happened in Washington, D.C. last week. So it's said that the government or agents such as FBI is definitely using the facial recognition technology to keep track of those like protesters. I would definitely have privacy concerns more for the technology being used by the private businesses. And in the end, it also depends on the purposes of the usage, whether or not there was sufficient governance making sure the proper usage and protection of the facial data, whether or not it has obtained consent from the users before they collect facial information from them.
One of my biggest concerns is the government entities using live facial recognition for mass surveillance. For example, Chinese government and also Russia have already implemented this technology for this purpose. The other concern is the proper data storage and sharing, because some companies, if they don't have like good security, Face ID credentials could be exposed to security threats.
I am in agreement with many of the points that they made, particularly there are risks. In particular, in a Canadian context, I think it's important to note that while in a democracy, because we have a level of control over what happens in the political context, because we elect those representatives who make the policies and create the laws that guide this kind of technology, it is absolutely not the case that we don't have things to worry about, even in a democratic context. And that's because this technology, particularly used in the wild, as one of your participants mentioned it could be, so, accessible through cameras that are live and studded throughout public and quasi-public spaces. In that case, the technology has the capacity to change the relationship fundamentally between an individual and the state. Because when we walk out our front door, we might expect to be recognized by the neighbor next door, but we absolutely don't expect that there are agents of law enforcement who are looking through cameras in the neighborhood and also know every time we walk out our front door who we are, where we are, what we're doing, or have the capacity to figure that out retrospectively if there's recordings. So this technology really does, even in a democracy, raise the risk of a mass surveillance technology and all of the privacy incursions that brings. And because privacy is a right that supports our other rights, it also puts at risk things like freedom of expression. Because if we felt like we were watched all the time by the state and could be identified, they could know exactly who we are and have a recording that shows what we're saying, we're probably not going to say things that are controversial. And yet, controversy and protest, dissent are really the lifeblood of a democracy. So in a weird way, in some ways, it's almost more of a risk in a democracy because it has the potential to stifle all those values that make a democracy live and vibrant and effective. The other interesting point that came up in relation to this was one of your participants who said, I might trust the government more than I would trust businesses. That's fascinating because what we have seen over the past decade, maybe even accelerating over the last couple of years, is a tendency for businesses to want all the information that they can possibly gather in order to figure out more information about us in order to make more money. And it's really reasonable as residents and humans in Canada to think that's maybe not an acceptable purpose for a very invasive technology. Maybe, and we can debate whether this is the case, but maybe there might be uses by the state that I would agree with if they're about public safety. And there's problems with that position, but many people would say that. But maybe it's so intrusive that if the motive is profit, that's just simply not fair. That's not reasonable. That's a step too far when it comes to the business-customer relationship. And particularly because we know that businesses are increasingly interested in using information not just to know more about us, but explicitly for the purpose of manipulating and controlling our behavior in relation to our economic transactions, where they could know not just what we're doing, but precisely who we are and what we look like while we're doing it, raises additional risks in that sort of consumer business equation.
If we consider that every recorded image and video can now be processed through facial recognition software, should there be laws governing this going forward?
I think it will be crucial to establish limits around all uses of the technology, and also the laws should address privacy risks because this kind of technology diminishes our ability to remain anonymous in public.
As leakage of the facial data could potentially result in severe consequences such as identity theft. More and more devices and applications, such as cell phone and banking applications, are using facial recognition technology as authentication. By obtaining the facial data, hackers could potentially use other AI technology, such as deepfake, to pretend as you in order to get unauthorized access to your data or assets.
There should be regulations for how to use them. They should only be used as a clue in identifying a suspect.
So there were sort of two themes in those responses that are both really important. One is around the security risks. And of course, anybody who's ever used a technology understands that there's no such thing as perfect tech. And likewise, there's no such thing as perfect security. So your participants very rightly pointed out that there are ways to circumvent security for facial recognition technologies. And I think at the root of what they're saying is the recognition that, again, if your face is hacked, it could be really difficult for an individual to prove that that was the case. And you can't replace your face. So we're potentially creating fundamental problems of authentication moving forward for individuals who are subject to not just the standard form of identity theft, where their ID numbers have been compromised, but a new and more frightening form of identity theft, where their face has been co-opted. So I think that the security concerns are really important, particularly when you think about all of the different contexts and the wide range of businesses and state agencies that might want to use the technology, because the protection of your face is only as strong as the weakest link in that change. If the weakest link is the corner store that wanted you to pay for your milk with your face, but don't have the sort of IT background or security expertise to properly secure that information, then your identity is at risk, not just at that store, but at your bank, at your school, at your workplace, in your home, any place where facial recognition technology starts to become used to authenticate you, to allow you access to entitlements or to physical spaces. So the security concerns are really important and really fundamentally need to be dealt with much more seriously than they have been. We're too trusting around tech security. And and that's a problem because we're also tend to trust that if it's technology, it's probably right. We believe the computer more than we believe our own minds sometimes. But the computer is a product of human minds and is absolutely fallible, as any person who does cybersecurity will be happy to tell you in great detail. The other sort of thread through those responses was about whether or not we need regulation for this technology. And I would go farther than your participants. I actually think that until we have regulation, and CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, has made this position very public, we think there should be a moratorium on the use of this technology until we have the legal framework in place to allow it to be used. But before we start talking about legal frameworks, we need to ask the really fundamental questions about if this technology can be used in ways that are rights respecting. In our perception, one of your participants at various points talked about the trade-off of convenience for privacy and the benefits of, the possible benefits of creating frictionless transactions using facial recognition technology. But from a rights perspective, we have to seriously ask the question, is a small amount of convenience or even a large amount of convenience really worth the exchange of risking letting a technology loose in the world that has the potential to render us perfectly identifiable to any party that uses the technology behind the scenes on cameras we might not even notice for their own purposes? Because that's the capacity of the technology. That's the risk we have to mitigate. So there's a fundamental question as to whether or not we can create and nurture the kind of society that we want to live in, and allow this technology to be out there in the wild.